Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this conversation. My name is Aaron Kotok, and I'm an executive director with Mitratech in our AdvanceLaw business, which is the data-based marketplace for outside counsel. We're diving today into one of the more pressing issues facing US-based multinational companies right now, and that's escalating trade tensions between the United States and Canada, or as I've been thinking about it lately, what's a little economic warfare between friends? Because let's be clear, we are talking about friends, neighboring countries that share the longest unguarded border in the world at 5,500 miles and almost 8,900 kilometers, and a trade relationship comprising over $2 billion in goods and services that cross the border every day. And here we are. GCs and other legal leaders are facing new and uncertain tariffs, retaliatory measures, and a shifting global trade landscape, and their CEOs, boards, and businesses are looking to them for guidance on how to navigate these stormy seas. So to help us unpack what's happening and what it means for your business, I'm joined by two top international trade lawyers from the AdvanceLaw network, both of whom have deep experience in cross-border issues, including working with each other in the past. From Canada, we have John Boscariol, a partner at McCarthy Tétrault and head of their international trade and investment law group. And from the US, Anthony Rappa, partner at Blank Rome and co-chair of the firm's international trade practice group. John and Anthony, welcome, and thank you both for being here. Before we dive in, I'd love for each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and share a bit about your work in this space. So, John, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you and the team at AdvanceLaw for pulling this important and very timely program together. And it's great to be here with Anthony as well. My name is John Boscariol. I practice in the International Trade and Investment Law Group here at McCarthy Tétrault. The practice area itself covers a fairly wide range of areas that would really address any aspect of cross-border trade in goods, services, or technology. Obviously, very recently, the focus has been on trade and tariff measures, and particularly the U.S. tariffs and Canada's response, both in terms of retaliatory surtaxes and other discriminatory government procurement policies. But the practice is more than that. It includes economic sanctions, export and technology transfer controls, advising and acting for parties under international trade agreements, international investment agreements, disputes with respect to those matters, and government procurement here in Canada. So very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you. Anthony?
Great. Thanks, Aaron. And also likewise, many thanks to the AdvanceLaw Network and for everyone who is tuning in or who will be tuning in. So Anthony Rappa, I am the co-chair of Blank Rome's international trade practice based in DC, where we are mere steps from the White House, the World Bank, the State Department, and most importantly for my day today, a great pizza place where I had lunch. Another story for another time. My practice and our group's practice focuses on the inbound and outbound movement of goods, technology, and investment. So that includes matters such as export control, tariffs and trade remedies, economic sanctions, and foreign investment review.
That's great. Thank you both. And we're going to get into this in a moment, but allow me to establish my own cross-border bona fides for a second. I'm a cross-border baby, born and raised in Buffalo, New York. I watched a lot of CBC, CTV, and CHCH in my youth with birthday parties and school events that were fed by Timbits. And I spent my summers up in the Muskoka region of Ontario. So I'm deeply interested and invested in this topic. Anyway, let's start with the big picture. Anthony, can you walk us through the key developments that have brought us to this moment? So starting with, I assume, the U.S. election, or maybe before that, the subsequent tariff announcements, Canada's response, the recent G7 summit. Walk us through, how did we get to where we are today?
Sure. So on some level in the U.S., skepticism over free trade is nothing new. If we look back to the North American Free Trade Agreement being adopted by the U.S. in the early 90s, there was a lot of political back and forth here in the U.S. regarding that. Ultimately, however, that became the consensus here in the U.S., is that there should be close trade integration between and among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Not to say that was the universal view. I mean, I could recall an incident when Barack Obama ran for president where he had suggested he was going to try to renegotiate NAFTA. But by and large, the consensus was this close trade integration. Of course, what we saw creep in over the years, not just in the US, but elsewhere, was this real skepticism over this globalized model, this free trade model, the free movement of goods. That led to a lot of skepticism in the US regarding entering into the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which had been a big initiative for the Obama administration. And of course, we saw that be a major issue in the first Trump campaign and ultimately was one of the driving forces that led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Of course, the Trump administration renegotiated NAFTA, as did, of course, Canada and Mexico. That led to the U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement, the USMCA. But even as of that time, it was inconceivable that the U.S. ever would do something like impose tariffs on Canada or Mexico. But as I mentioned, during these years, obviously during the first Trump administration, continuing into the Biden administration, there really was this growing skepticism around free trade, mainly directed at China and concerns relating to the U.S. relationship with China, different national security threats emerging from that. But as time went on, especially into the second or the 2024 Trump campaign and the early days of the Trump presidency, this sort of crystallized into concerns around kind of free trade, period, and trading relationships, not just with national security threats like China, but just with any country that is perceived as presenting an economic security threat to the U.S. So what we have seen kind of in a nutshell as between the U.S. and Canada, but also with other trading partners, the U.S. and Canada, the Trump administration introduced a 25% tariff against Canada on the ground that Canada was not doing enough to stem the flow of fentanyl or illegal immigration into the United States. The U.S. did the same thing with Mexico. And as it pertains to fentanyl, did the same thing with China. On the statutory ground of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the U.S. sanctions law, essentially. Now, there's a very important exclusion for this for Canada, which is that goods that are eligible under the USMCA rules of origin are excluded from these tariffs, which covers a lot, does not cover everything. So what have we kind of seen in the midst of all of this? We saw the resignation of Prime Minister Trudeau. But in really kind of an amazing political comeback that no one could have predicted, before this new Trump presidency, we saw Mark Carney and the Liberal Party hang on to power in Canada, which has very significant implications for the U.S.-Canada relationship. Now, obviously, Prime Minister Carney has taken what we would expect him to do, which is to take a strong line in protecting Canadian interests. That's not to say that he and President Trump have gotten off on the wrong foot interpersonally. They had a meeting in the White House. They have spoken otherwise. They were at least in the same place together at the G7 summit recently, which was cut short by concerns regarding Israel and Iran and that whole situation. But, what we've seen kind of overall, maybe to kind of complete the thought, the U.S. has imposed these reciprocal tariffs, not only setting to the side what has happened with the U.S. and Canada, the U.S. has pursued reciprocal tariffs against dozens of other countries that are perceived to have trade barriers in place against the U.S. Those are also issued under authority of IEEPA. All of this has been challenged in court, including the Canadian fentanyl and immigration tariffs. The Court of International Trade has held that the president does not have the authority to issue these tariffs under IEEPA, but that is working its way through the appellate courts and is expected eventually to reach the Supreme Court. The important thing to note in terms of the current state of play is that while the Court of International Trade has held that they do not have any statutory basis, the appellate court has issued a stay against that ruling pending appeal. So the tariffs continue to be collected in the meantime. And of course, anyone who's involved in trade, as between the U.S. and Canada, or as between the U.S. and other countries that are subject to reciprocal tariffs, that remains in effect. So U.S. and Canada, there's a big exclusion for USMCA goods. U.S. and much of the rest of the world, there's currently a 10% baseline tariff. And all of this stuff is making its way up to the Supreme Court. And of course, Aaron, everything that I just discussed really is in connection with imports and questions around tariffs. But it is important to note that Canada, for many years, really has occupied just about the most preferential position under US law from an export control perspective. Canada enjoys very extensive license free treatment for many exports of controlled items from the United States. That continues to be the case. I'm not aware of any proposal to change that. Of course, everything on some level is subject to change and everything is fluid. But I think that's an important thing to note regarding the US Canada trade relationship is that on the export control side of things, Canada continues to occupy a very preferential and important position for the United States.
John, I'd love for you to weigh in from the Canadian perspective. I happened to be in Toronto on election day and watching the news. It was fascinating being an American in Canada
Right.
in an election that seemed to be entirely about one person. Both sides were just talking about Trump the entire time and about tariffs, at least on that day. What's your take from the Canadian side? How is this playing out politically and economically in Canada? And what's the Canadian perspective on the developments that Anthony has shared?
Yeah, so let me really just try and boil this down to 4 succinct points, and then we can get into the details in the discussion. I think it's important to understand, and you alluded to this earlier on, Aaron, from the Canadian perspective, we have had the closest, most significant economic relationship between our two countries that exists in the world. And no other two countries are as closely aligned economically, or at least have been in the past, as Canada and the United States. And this is the product of, Anthony mentioned NAFTA, this is the product really of integration that was well underway post-World War II. We had the Auto Pact in the 1960s. We had the Free Trade Agreement, huge debate here in Canada, free trade agreement between Canada and the US. In the 80s, Canada basically made its bet at that point and said, yeah, we're going to align very closely economically with the United States in the 1980s. 1990s, we bring Mexico into the fold. And this integration has just continued. It's not just in the auto sector, it's other sectors as well. A very tight integration between our two economies. And for Canada, it's a critical issue because 2/3 of our GDP is driven by international trade. That's a much lower number for the United States. A lot of your GDP is driven in the United States by internal consumption. In Canada, it's 2/3 is international trade. So for us, this issue has absolutely dominated the media. It's dominated the discourse up here in Canada. And I think when GCs are looking at these issues, particularly if they're not located in Canada, but they're dealing with Canadian counterparts or their Canadian operations, they need to understand just how sensitive this has become for Canadians. And I think the sense of betrayal that many Canadians feel as a result of this. And we do understand that there's likely a disconnect between the U.S. leadership and many of the U.S. business partners and friends and relatives we have in the United States. But really, we're in a position now here in Canada where obviously we have to respond. That response has come in the form of retaliatory measures at the provincial level, for example, where many of the provinces handle the distribution of alcohol products. U.S. alcohol products have been pulled off our store shelves in most of the provinces in this country. We've imposed retaliatory surtaxes, as we call them, against a significant swath of U.S. product coming up here into Canada. The provinces, in particular the province of Ontario, has implemented a discriminatory procurement policy which discriminates against U.S. suppliers of goods and services to the government. The Canadian government announced that it's looking at something similar at the federal level, which was really to respond, I think, in part to the Trump increase in steel and aluminum tariffs from 25% to 50%. Canada announced that it's now looking at another counter tariff response to that. They're going to hold off until July 19th, which is after the expiry of the 30-day period that was announced at the G7, where Canada and the US are negotiating some kind of agreement to deal with the tariffs. So from the Canadian side, a lot is going on. But the third point I wanted to focus on was China. China is very much a driver, as Anthony mentioned, of all of this. Perhaps up here in Canada, it's a little less obvious to us because, again, the U.S. is our most important trading partner. 80% of our exports go to the United States. We're very closely linked with the United States. But We understand too up here in Canada that China is a threat in certain respects and that we need to align ourselves with the US policy on China. So even before Trump, at least before the second Trump administration, Canada was working to align itself with the Biden policy, trade policy on China. Last fall, we implemented 100% tariffs on EVs from China, 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel products from China. Those tariffs on their face arguably violate our WTO agreements, but no matter, I think the Canadian government at that time, the Trudeau government, very much recognized that we do need to align ourselves with China. And evermore the sense of betrayal here when Trump in his second term announced these these tariffs against Canada based on allegations about our inability to control fentanyl moving across the border or illegal immigration moving from Canada to the United States. The fourth and final point I'd make is on the framework, this economic warfare framework. I do think from the GC's perspective now, the framework at which they look at these issues has changed fundamentally. The Canadian government, I think at this point, our current Prime Minister Carney has said the relationship between Canada and the United States has changed fundamentally. But I think there's also been an even broader change in the framework where no longer are we in an environment of duties coming down, and where we can rely on international trade agreement commitments. It's completely changed. And this idea of economic warfare that you mentioned, Aaron, I think sounds like an overblown term, but it really isn't in this environment. The Canadian government has signaled that it very much views measures like export controls, like tariffs, like foreign investment reviews, such your equivalent of CFIUS in the United States, as measures they will be using going forward to protect and advance our economic security. If you had said something like that to me 2 years ago, I would have said that is not the Canadian approach. And I would have been shocked by that. But Canada came out about 8 months or so ago hearing and said that they were launching consultations on this protection and advancement of economic security, and that they were going to be looking at all of these things as tools for those purposes. So again, from the GC's perspective, I think there's a whole new framework they're going to have to deal with this going forward.
So let's hum a few more bars then on that hymnal, I guess. Right? I was going to have this conversation around what does economic warfare look like, and I believe you both aptly described that. So if I'm a GC, if I'm a legal team at a US-based multinational that's caught in the crossfire of this economic warfare, what does that actually mean for policy, for advising the business, for advising the board? How should GCs be thinking about the most immediate legal and operational considerations in the context of this economic warfare? John, I'll start with you and then we'll flip over to Anthony for your reaction.
Yeah, so I think it's important to recognize that we really haven't seen this level of geopolitical tension in our lifetimes before. So I'm going beyond just the relationship between Canada and the US at this point and just looking at what's going on internationally. And this tension level really hasn't been as exacerbated. You'd have to go back to the pre-World War II era to find this, where international tensions are so high. And it feels like, I'm not suggesting things are going to come to an end with a World War III or something like that, but things are coming to a head of some kind. And I do think from a GC's perspective, those international developments now are more important than they ever have been before. And that's really what's driving this. So no longer can they rely on, repeating myself a bit, but no longer can they rely on those international trade agreements. And that, I'm dating myself, but when we started practicing in the mid-1990s, that was all the rage. We were excited about NAFTA. We were excited about the agreements of the World Trade Organization. We were going out to clients telling them duties are coming down, markets are opening up. We have opportunities to pry open markets with these international trade agreements. And that's no longer the case. And I think now from a GC perspective, they're really going to have to pay attention to the individual policies within these various countries. And, more particularly how, at least at this point, how countries are reacting to the US policies and understand that we're no longer in this period of open access to markets anymore. And we're going to have to be a lot more responsive, a lot more agile in terms of responding to government measures that are really, as we say, economic warfare measures. At the tip of that spear, for sure, is economic sanctions, and it's always been there. But when we look at the mechanisms Trump used to impose tariffs against Canada and Mexico and other countries under IEEPA, that's a economic sanctions legislation. And so the dynamic has completely shifted, at least from our perspective up here in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, Anthony, how are you advising GCs? What should they be doing right now to protect their companies in the midst of the current economic warfare and then where it could potentially go?
Yeah, so I would really echo a lot of John's comments there. Maybe to put a point on it, as I mentioned kind of towards the beginning of our discussion here, especially coming out of the end of the Cold War, there was a very optimistic sense that by prying open markets, as John said, and by binding the world together through trade, not only would that lead to prosperity, a rising tide of prosperity for many people in the world, but that it would lead to closer, enhanced understanding of peoples, and if not closer political integration, but a form of conflict resolution or elimination of conflict through trade, the binding of people together through trade. We have seen the high watermark of that line of thinking, and I think we could sort of safely conclude now that the open globalized model that had persisted before is gone. I'm not sure that it'll come back. It may see a renaissance at some point, but we are in an extended moment right now in which not only has the United States, but other countries around the world have turned away from that model. And, there are different reasons for that. It would be the subject of 5 podcasts if we were to get into that. I think the capsule version of that is that model did not necessarily bring about necessarily the types of changes in behavior on the part of countries like Russia and China.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, some may have hoped. Also, politically and socioeconomically, maybe there have been concerns that the gains of this model have not been broadly shared. Again, you can talk about that in 10 podcasts, right? And what that has meant around the world politically. But for one reason or another, we have now passed through that moment and we're in a different one. And I remember a few years ago, back when we thought maybe we can get that moment back, I was having this conversation with a trade association. This happens to be a trade association that in particular has really benefited greatly from, the free movement of technology and joint R&D and free trade. They were not big fans of the message that maybe this moment was gone. And the predominant question in the room is, well, isn't anybody in DC paying attention to this? Like, we've done so well because of this. Others have done so well because of this. Like, isn't anyone paying attention to what is slipping through our fingers right now? And I said, look, I'm not right or wrong here. I am going to tell you that in DC, the view you're advocating for now is the minority view. And in the years since I had that particular conversation, that's even more the case today here in DC. So that's all to say, but to bring it to your question, Aaron, for GCs, it's really what John just said, which is no one who's engaged in planning right now can kind of seriously expect that open globalized free trade model is coming back in the near future, maybe not even in the medium term.
Mm-hmm.
And that means whether you want to call it economic warfare, whether you want to use the more polite term that we use occasionally, which is economic statecraft. That's the more polite way of saying economic warfare, right? But whatever you want to call it, these are tools that are going to be wielded not only by the U.S., but by other countries that are going to seek to protect their national interests in a world that is becoming more fragmented. So that means more checkpoints on the movement of goods, technology, and investment, inbound and outbound, which creates transaction costs. It can create delays, points of friction. It means you need to really try to see around corners and think through your supply chain strategies. But it really syncs up with what John was saying, which is things have changed. We can't really expect the old ways coming back anytime soon. And to adapt, you've got to think about a world of these checkpoints and transaction costs, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so that I'd add to that. So where the rubber really hits the road when a GC is asking, okay, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for my organization? I mean, just think about the trade and traffic department of an organization in the past, which probably didn't get a lot of attention.
Mm.
When tariffs were at zero or very low, they were basically viewed as shuffling papers around back and forth, making filings, but product crosses the border. There wasn't a huge tax or tariff on it. There's no worry for that. That's completely changed now. Those folks in those departments are the heroes. And in fact, they're in short supply. Everyone is going to have to be expanding. If things continue the way they are, they're going to be expanding their trade and traffic departments. They're going to be retaining more experts, either internally or externally, to figure out how do we deal with these measures, these obstacles now that Anthony mentions at the border for getting goods, services, and technology cross-border in either direction. On the Canadian side, we have a remission order in place, which allows, in certain circumstances, for your product to avoid the retaliatory surtax. On the US side, Canadian goods now do, if they qualify under the USMCA as originating, they can avoid, for the most part, that 25% tariff that's in place. So there are opportunities now. And in fact, there was a recent study done by RBC Economics, which looked at the effective average tariff rate of products going into the US. Right now, Canadian products go into the US at the lowest effective tariff rate of any of the US major trading partners. They're estimating something in the 3 to 5% range as an average overall effective tariff rate. That can be viewed as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Now, part of the challenge will be is that it feels like, at least in these last few months, that the ground is constantly shifting. And are we going to be making big decisions based on how President Trump might feel one day to another, how that policy changes? And is it, as they say, taco Trump? Trump always chickens out, as a crude way of kind of saying, I think the pattern has been a very extreme threat, the implementation of that threat for a few days, and then a pullback. How long will that continue? Will this settle at some point? And hopefully we're going to see that in the next month or so. And certainly when it settles at that point, let's look at the opportunities that are available, because I think there's a very positive message here for GCs as well, that once you put in the time and effort, you will see that there are opportunities when you look at the relative competitive position of your operations, whether they're in Canada or other countries, in terms of accessing that very valuable U.S. market.
Yeah, let's. I think that's going to be a note. I think maybe perhaps to kind of frame our final conversation around this point. If we're in a world, and I've seen it referred to as shifting from G7 to G0, right? The retreat from multilateral and even bilateral relationships. There's an optimistic view that this is a blip, and negotiations are going to continue. We're going to reshuffle and resettle, and maybe it's not exactly as free trade as it was before, but we'll get to something that feels a bit more like what we're used to. If it's not, what's the optimistic view in a world where this economic statecraft, to use Anthony's term, continues? What are the opportunities? Are there opportunities in nearshoring operation? Are there opportunities in diversifying the mix of goods? Are there opportunities in relocating or reorganizing your supply chain routes? What's the what is the most optimistic view we can paint for GCs in a world in which this ongoing economic warfare or statecraft continues? Anthony, why don't you take that first, and then we'll toss it to John.
Yeah, so I think that first of all, there are things that in this type of a model, there are things that are strongly incentivized and will be rewarded. And let's just start with kind of the most obvious and then get into the more nuanced. But the most obvious thing is that onshoring and investing in the US from the US perspective is going to be treated very favorably here.
Mhm.
Right. And in a way, although it is, altering other arrangements and other plans that companies and economic operators and investors may have, those who are looking for angles to play and to participate in activity that'll be viewed favorably in this environment here in the US, that is the most obvious case. And also, I guess the corollary to that, although I don't want to oversimplify this, the corollary to that is that that is also the only surefire way to avoid tariffs is to be producing here or sourcing here. Now, I'm not going to, I say I don't want to oversimplify that because you can't wave a magic wand and have that magically be something that's economically feasible or have, that kind of supply at your fingertips. But again, companies are thinking through whether that makes sense or it's even possible. But to carry through beyond the very obvious and to get into what is an optimistic vision of this landscape, an optimistic vision is that the very high reciprocal tariffs that are being thrown around do not end up being fully implemented because in one form or another, the administration is able to reach kind of framework understandings with different trading partners where, in an odd way, maybe it brings about, trade barriers coming down on both sides, maybe. But, what might end up having stickiness to it is that 10% baseline, where at least the White House is kind of telegraphing and the administration is telegraphing, they want that to stick around for the long term. Now, again, like John said, this stuff is fluid, and there's a lot that could be negotiated. I think the UK is coming back to the table to try to get rid of their 10%, which did not go away with their trade deal. But if the 10% has stickiness, but the 30, 40, 50% that have been thrown around go away, then the optimistic vision of this is that trading partners find a way to absorb this 10% without a lot of pain and without too much of that being passed on to the consumer and without that really driving any type of inflation crisis. And that somehow through all of this, at the end of all of this, even though we're not going to see the same level of economic integration that we had seen before, maybe we do see a return to a sort of natural multilateralism that has prevailed now for decades. And maybe the onshoring is not just onshoring, but it's friendshoring. And maybe, to John's point, to the extent that there are countries that view China as a threat for whatever reason, or who view Russia as a threat, or who are concerned about things like the challenges of AI and what that's going to do to our economies in the years and in the decades to come. These are countries with shared values that, again, may not have the same level of economic integration, but could still continue to be collaborating as they have been to uphold what has been a fairly successful world order for the last 80 years. How do you translate that into things that could benefit companies and things that GCs could think about? Again, with this notion that the 10% may have stickiness, maybe as we see through and work through these trade deals and the fits and starts and the pain points and get back to kind of recoalescing into this multilateralism, maybe that means that smooths out and eliminates the future flare-ups of things like what we've seen in the last 5 months. So maybe this isn't the administration trying to totally overturn the table and disrupt everything. Maybe it's a rebaselining of trade relationships. And it smooths out these bumps. But to put it one way, these bumps that we've seen in the last 5 months.
Sure. John, reasons for GC optimism, or at least opportunity in all this disruption?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that, and I largely agree with what Anthony is saying, and that type of approach GCs should take here and be open to. Canada, before this happened most recently, I think, was a very outward-looking country where we understand how important trade is, not just with the United States, although that's the biggest trading partner we have, but with others as well. So when we think about diversification, Canada already has a free trade agreement in place with the European Union. They have an agreement or arrangement in place with the UK. They have the Trans-Pacific Partnership in place with Japan, Mexico, Australia, other Pacific nations. And I think when NAFTA was in the mix as well, Canada really viewed themselves almost as being the hub and all these spokes going out to these other trading nations. So Canada does have them, I think, is in the best position out of the G7 countries right now in terms of those trade agreements. The problem is when a very important part of that hub, namely the United States, or the spoke, I guess, if you will, in that analysis, the United States falls away, then that arrangement doesn't look so great. There are, of course, lots of opportunities for diversification still because we still have those trade agreements in place with the other players. So I think that opportunity is still available, although it's important to keep in mind that protectionism and tariffs from one country beget protectionism and tariffs from other countries. And already we saw in the announcement from Canada and previous consultations, it's announced that it is already looking at tariffs and other measures against countries other than the United States as a result of the US tariffs. So when the US tariff wall goes up, the products previously coming in from other countries now have to find a different home. And Canada doesn't want to be the neighbor next door that gets all of that and gets its market flooded, particularly for commodity items like steel and aluminum. And so we saw that announcement yesterday that Canada's looking at putting in place tariff rate quotas and tariffs to deal with steel and aluminum products coming from places other than the United States. And I don't think that's going to be restricted to that. I think that's going to apply to other products as well and other commodities as time goes on. And that's part of the problem with protectionism to begin with. It's a very downward spiral, if you will, where everyone starts to engage in a kind of beggar thy neighbor policy when it comes to measures like this. I do think at the end we're going to reach some form of equilibrium, I think, but it's not going to be just a handful of major trade agreements. It's going to be a patchwork of these agreements or arrangements, which makes the GC's job much more difficult, particularly if they're trying to figure out what are the trade barriers and tariffs that they need to deal with, what are the different rules of origin they're going to need to deal with. It's going to be a much more challenging environment, but I do think we're going to end up settling somewhere with a patchwork of these agreements. I'd hate to say we're going to see 30, 40 different patchwork agreements. It kind of feels though like we're headed in that direction, and so I think we're going to have to prepare for something like that.
I thought my question was about opportunities and optimism, John. I don't feel like you painted a lot there. Understood. So this has been a fantastic discussion. I do think we need to wrap. So before we close, I'd love to ask each of you one last question, and concisely so. So if you were advising, as you are, a GC literally today, what's the one thing above all that you would recommend that they prioritize right now in light of the developments in U.S.-Canadian cross-border trade? John, you were just talking, so we'll let you finish.
Yeah, so I will end on an optimistic note because I do think there's opportunity if you put the time and resources into it. And that would be my first recommendation to GCs, and I try and make it as specific as possible. But really up to this point, and it's completely expected, it's been a very reactionary response from companies to this. And it has to be, because things feel like they're changing almost on a daily basis. But it's important to kind of step back and look for those opportunities. And if you're going to look for and find those opportunities, you're really going to need that trade expertise, that understanding of these relationships, the understanding of what the rules of origin are, understanding of a lot of the exceptions and relief available under these measures. I think that's going to continue. It's going to be complex, but that's going to continue. And this isn't an advertisement for getting external counsel necessarily. You're going to have to build that internally, I think, within your organization. So it's an advertisement for hiring really strong trade practitioners and that expertise internally within your organization, because this is going to be a very important function if it's at the compliance or legal level, however you deal with it within your organization. It's going to be a critical function in your organization going forward.
That's a great point. We recently gathered a bunch of GCs for a series of executive roundtables, and one of them talked about how, in light of all this, he turned to his legal team and said, you're going to be reskilled. We are going to train you up on international trade and tariffs. You are now the experts. And in a lot of ways, it was sort of an internal kind of professional reward opportunity. All of a sudden, after years of practicing whatever they've been practicing in that legal department, learning, getting deep in a brand new area of expertise is super interesting. All right, Anthony, one thing for GCs to prioritize today.
Well, Aaron, it's a rule of thumb. If you ask an attorney to come up with one thing, he's going to give you three. But we're gonna keep it tight though. So synthesize, strategize, vocalize. Synthesize. Knowledge is power here, and that's a cliche, but it's very true here. There's a lot going on in the US, in Canada, China, the EU, trade barriers being discussed all around the world that change every day. They wax and they wane. Sometimes they change through a social media post. It's difficult to keep track of this stuff, but it is absolutely vital to maintain this inward flow of information to your key decision makers, and to be synthesizing it and thinking through what does it mean. strategize. So this is the type of thing that really does lend itself to strategizing around your supply chains where you're going to have operations. Will you be retooling people to be more focused on tariffs, customs, trade compliance? How do you bring trade related decision making into the C-suite? That's all in relation to strategizing and then vocalize. It's not the end of the story that a tariff comes down and that's it. And I know I said we've kind of moved through this open globalized model. I think that we have. But I think any particular trade action, tariff action that's issued by any government, that's not the end of the story. It might be the beginning. So trade associations and companies can make their views heard politically. Certainly, there's a lot of that going on in the U.S. Set to the side whether what legal remedies may exist, but at least politically, there's a lot that's going to be hashed out in the U.S. in terms of how industry reacts to all of this, and everybody's got a seat at that table. And I think companies often can feel as if they are just completely isolated and all they can do is react and find a way to kind of deal with whatever's put on their plate. But there's more to it than that. And companies should think through not only how to comply and deal with what's on their plate, but is there a way for them to be part of the conversation?
It's great. Thank you for that. I was not expecting that we were going to end today with a poetic rhyme. So synthesize, strategize, vocalize. I think we can all take that home. So thank you both. Really, it was an ambitious conversation and we covered a lot of ground, but it was important ground. So thank you. And a quick reminder to our listeners that we at Advanced Law, we're here. We stand ready to help our listeners connect with best fit and highly motivated outside counsel from deeply vetted firms in the US and Canada and around the world, just like Blank Rome and McCarthy Tatro. So please reach out to me. You can find me at aaron.kotok@advancedlaw.com. You can reach out to me to learn more and to help us connect you with great lawyers, whether on US Canada cross border issues like Anthony and John, or on any other issue that we can bring to our over 5,000 law firm partners at our advanced law firms. So thanks for listening, and thanks again to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.